"Are you waiting for someone?" the man asked. Nora didn't look up. She kept her eyes on the pavement crack running between her feet, the kind of crack that spreads slowly over years until the whole surface gives way. She knew how that felt. "No," she said. "I'm not waiting for anyone." It was the truest sentence she had spoken in months. The evening had gone cold the way October evenings do in Ohio. Not gradually, not with warning, but all at once, as though the air had made a decision. Nora Hale sat on the wooden bench outside the Millbrook Community Center with a canvas bag at her feet and nowhere particular to go. Inside the bag, 2 changes of clothes, her mother's rosary, a folder of documents she'd been told to take when she left, and a toothbrush still in its pharmacy wrapper because she hadn't had time to open it before her husband handed her the bag and opened the front door. She had stood there for a moment, she remembered. Just stood there, holding the bag, looking at the man she had loved for 11 years. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," Stewart had said. That was 3 hours ago. Now the streetlight above the bench flickered. The community center behind her was closing. She could hear the staff turning off lights, the heavy clunk of a deadbolt. She didn't move. Moving felt like admitting something she wasn't ready to admit. The man who had asked if she was waiting for someone sat down on the far end of the bench. Not close. Not intrusively close. The kind of distance a person leaves when they're being deliberate about it. She glanced at him, late 50s, maybe early 60s. A jacket that had seen better decades. Reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He had the look of someone who had driven an old truck for so long he'd stopped noticing it was old. "Cold night," he said. "Yes," Nora said. He didn't say anything else for a while. That was unusual, in her experience. Most people who started conversations couldn't stop having them. A car pulled out of the parking lot, then another. Then the lot was mostly empty, and the 2 of them sat in the particular silence of a Tuesday evening in a town where nothing much happens after 7. "I don't mean to pry," the man said finally, "but I've been sitting here for 10 minutes and you haven't moved, and you don't have a coat on, and it's 43 degrees. Nora looked down at her arms. She hadn't noticed she was cold. That was strange. She pressed her fingers to her forearm and felt the skin, and it felt far away, like touching someone else. "I'm fine," she said. "All right?" he said. Another minute passed. "My name is Franklin Ames," he said. "I run a small company about 2 miles from here. I come to the community center on Tuesdays because my youngest daughter has a piano lesson inside, and I sit out here because the waiting room smells like old carpet and I have a hard time with closed spaces." He said it matter-of-factly. No apology in it. Nora looked at him again. There was nothing remarkable about him, and yet she had the odd feeling that this was intentional, that he had spent a long time making himself look unremarkable. "Nora Hale," she said. "Nora." He nodded like the name made sense. "Do you have somewhere to go tonight, Nora?" She opened her mouth to say yes. The word didn't come. Franklin Ames waited. He was, she would later think, the most patient man she had ever met, not because he lacked urgency, but because he seemed to understand that some answers needed space to arrive. "Not exactly," she finally said. He nodded again, slowly. He looked out at the parking lot. "I have a big house," he said. "Too big for 3 people. My housekeeper retired in August, and I haven't replaced her because my daughters keep telling me they'll help, and then they don't, because they're children, and children don't really understand what running a house means until they're old enough to have one themselves." He paused. "The guest room has its own bathroom. It's clean. I changed the sheets last week because I was expecting my brother, and then he canceled." Nora stared at him. "I'm not," she started. "I know," he said. "I'm not suggesting anything improper. I have 2 daughters at home, 12 and 15, and a full-time job, and I'm telling you that I have a room and you don't seem to have anywhere to go, and it is 43 degrees. He turned and looked at her directly for the first time. His eyes were steady and dark and held nothing she could find threatening. "You can say no. I'll understand completely." She should have said no. Every reasonable part of her knew that. You don't get into a car with a stranger. You don't go to a stranger's house. You don't accept help from a man you met on a bench outside a community center at 7 in the evening with a flickering streetlight and a bag of clothes and a rosary that had belonged to a woman who had warned her once to be careful of men who make decisions. Seems simple, but her mother had also said, the ones who ask quietly are usually safer than the ones who never ask at all. "Okay," Nora said. She said it before she understood that she had. The house was not what she expected. She had built some idea of it in the 7-minute drive. A modest place, maybe, consistent with the jacket and the quiet and the way he'd mentioned his company with no elaboration. The way people mention things they don't feel the need to prove. She had expected something practical. What she found was a house that had clearly once been someone's life project, and then become simply someone's life. A wide front porch with a swing that leaned slightly to the left. Flower beds that had been loved once and were now going gently wild. A basketball hoop in the driveway with one of those nets that had been replaced too many times, the newest section bright white against the older weather-grade strands. Inside, it smelled like dinner had happened recently. Something with garlic. Dad. A girl appeared at the top of the stairs. 15 maybe, with her father's dark eyes and the particular expression teenagers wear when they're trying to decide whether to be suspicious or curious. "Who's that? This is Nora Hale," Franklin said, setting his keys on the hook by the door. He did it without ceremony, the automatic gesture of a man in his own home. "She's going to stay in the guest room for a while." "Nora, that's my older daughter, Addie." Addie Ames looked at Nora with an assessment that was almost clinical. Then something shifted. "Are you okay?" Addie asked. It was such a direct question, the way only a teenager can ask something without the social armor adults learn to wear. Nora felt something move in her chest, a small, involuntary thing, like a door blown open by wind. "I'm working on it," Nora said. Addie nodded like that was a perfectly good answer. "There are leftovers in the fridge. Dad always makes too much pasta." "I make the right amount," Franklin said. "You all just don't eat enough." "We eat fine," Addie said, already retreating back to her room. "The littler one's asleep, by the way. She has a cold." Franklin looked briefly toward the hallway, the automatic redirect of a parent's attention. "I'll check on her in a minute." Then to Nora, "Come on, I'll show you the room." The guest room was at the end of the hall, and it was exactly as he had described. Clean, simple, sheets that still had the crease of recent laundering. A window that looked onto the backyard, which had an oak tree in it big enough to have been there before the house. A lamp with a warm bulb, a hook on the back of the door. "There are extra blankets in the closet," Franklin said from the doorway. He didn't come in. "Bathroom's through there. Lock works from the inside. If you need anything, the kitchen's always open." He turned to go. "Mr. Ames," Nostura said. He stopped. "Why?" she asked. "You don't know me." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the floor and then at some middle distance that seemed to contain an answer he was testing for the right words. "My wife died 4 years ago," he said finally. "Car accident. And for about a week after, I had nowhere to be. Not because I didn't have a house, but because the house had stopped being a place. You understand what I mean?" She understood exactly what he meant. "Someone made me dinner," he said. "A neighbor I barely knew. She just knocked on the door with a pot of soup and didn't stay and didn't ask anything. And I don't know why, but that was the thing that let me cry for the first time. Something about a stranger's kindness. It broke something open that nothing else could." He looked at her. "So," he said, "that's why." He left and pulled the door almost closed behind him. Not all the way. Just enough. Nora sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the window and at the oak tree and at the October dark beyond it, and for the first time in hours she felt her hands. She stayed a week. Then she stayed another. It happened without anyone deciding it. Franklin had mentioned, the second morning, that the kitchen was a disaster and the laundry was 3 loads behind, and Addie's cold had transferred to him and the younger girl, Ruby, who was 8 and had a persistent cough that kept her home from school. Nora, who had nowhere to be and nothing to do that mattered and needed, more than she would have admitted, to be useful, had said, "Let me help." Franklin had tried to protest. She hadn't let him. Ruby Ames was, Nora would later think, one of the most unusual children she had ever met. She was serious the way some children are, not unhappy, just oriented toward gravity, as though she had decided early on that the world deserved her close attention. She had her mother's photograph on her nightstand, and sometimes talked to it, not in a sad way, but informally, the way you'd update someone who'd been away on a trip. "Mom, I have a cold." Ruby had announced to the photograph on the second day, while Nora sat in the chair by the window reading to her. "But Nora is making me tea with honey, and it's actually good. She puts lemon in it." Nora had looked up from the book. Ruby was watching her with dark, serious eyes. "Is that okay?" the girl asked. "The lemon? The lemon is very good for you," Nora said. "That's what I thought." Ruby said, satisfied, and went back to listening. She fit herself into the house the way water fits into the space it finds, not by force, but by following what was already there. She learned that Franklin left for work at 7:15 and came back by 6 unless there was a problem at the plant, at which point he'd call from the road and be late and sound tired but not harried. She learned that Addie was excellent at math and terrible at asking for help, and had a habit of standing in the kitchen at 10 at night eating cereal because she'd forgotten dinner. She learned that Ruby kept a nature journal and had been doing so since she was 5, and her mother had given her the first one, and that the journal contained pressed leaves and careful observations and occasional questions addressed directly to the universe, like why do birds migrate if they could just stay warm? She learned that Franklin Ames ran a manufacturing company that employed about 400 people in the county, which she discovered not from him but from Addie, who mentioned it in passing the way you mention things that have always simply been true. "Is it a big company?" Nora had asked. Addie shrugged. "I don't know. He never really talks about it. He just works." She paused. "He's on some board, I think, or like a few boards. I don't know. He doesn't tell us stuff like that." Nora had thought about that. The jacket, the bench, the patience, the way he'd told her about the soup. She had come to understand that Franklin Ames was a man who had arranged his life so that the most important parts of it were invisible to anyone who wasn't paying attention. Stuart called on a Thursday. She stepped outside onto the back porch to take it, standing under the oak tree in the cold with her hand tight around the phone. "I just want to make sure you're okay," Stuart said. He said it in the voice he used when he wanted something. "I'm fine," Nora said. "Where are you staying?" "With a friend." Silence. "We need to talk about the paperwork," he said. "I know," she said. "The house." "I know, Stuart," she heard him breathe. She had spent 11 years listening to him breathe in various configurations. The irritated breath, the tired breath, the breath that preceded an argument, the careful breath he used when he thought he was being reasonable. "I'm sorry," he said, "that it didn't work out the way we planned." What a sentence. What a way to fold everything into nothing. "I am too," she said, because it was true, because she was sorry. Sorry for the years, sorry for the wanting, sorry for the trying, sorry for the ultrasounds and the appointments and the 2 rounds of IVF that hadn't worked and the one conversation 3 months ago when Stuart had sat across the kitchen table and said, with great deliberateness, "I need to be honest with you about what I want. I've always wanted children. That's not something I'm able to let go of." And Nora had said, with the same deliberateness, "I know." And that had been the beginning of the end, and they had spent 3 months arriving at it. She didn't say any of this on the phone. She said, "Have the lawyers send the paperwork. I'll review it." She hung up and stood under the oak tree for a long time. The leaves were mostly down. The branches made precise, complicated shapes against the sky, all those divisions and subdivisions that eventually became fine enough to look like nothing at all, like the tree was just suggesting itself against the gray. The back door opened. Ruby came out in her coat and boots, nature journal under one arm, and stopped when she saw Nora. "You're crying," Ruby said, not accusatory, observational. "A little," Nora admitted. Ruby came and stood next to her and looked up at the oak tree with the same attention she gave everything. "When my mom died," Ruby said, "I cried for like a whole week straight, and then I stopped, and it was weird because I felt bad for stopping." She turned her head and looked at Nora. "But Dad said that stopping doesn't mean you stopped caring. It just means you needed to breathe." Nora looked at her. "Your dad is a smart man," she said. "Yeah," Ruby agreed. "He just doesn't act like it." She opened her journal and uncapped her pen. "I'm looking for a good branch to draw. Do you want to help me pick one?" Nora looked at the tree. "All those branches." "Yes," she said. "I think I do." Franklin found out about the divorce on a Friday evening by accident. He had come home early, a rare thing, and found Nora sitting at the kitchen table with the folder of documents, the one she'd carried in the canvas bag from the beginning. She had been going through them with a pen, and something in how she was sitting, the set of her shoulders, the way her hand had gone still on the page, told him without telling him. He put down his bag and went to the refrigerator and got out the orange juice, because the girls liked orange juice in the evenings, and he had never broken the habit of pouring it even when they weren't there yet. "Do you want some?" he asked. "Yes," she said, without looking up. He poured 2 glasses and sat down across from her and said nothing. The kitchen clock ticked, the refrigerator made its small sound. 11 years, Nora said to the documents. Franklin wrapped both hands around his glass. He wanted children, she said. I can't have them. He waited, he tried, and then he decided he couldn't wait anymore. She stopped. That's the whole story. That's the whole thing. She looked up finally. There was no performance in her face, no appeal for sympathy, no careful arrangement of expression. Just her face, as it was. Do you think he was wrong? Franklin asked. She was quiet. No, she said. I think he wanted something real, and it was real, and it wasn't wrong to want it. She looked out the window. I needed more time to be angry at him before I could get to that part. Franklin nodded. I'm sorry, he said. Not in the hollow way. Not sorry it didn't work out. Just sorry, as though the word meant exactly what it said. You lost your wife, Nora said. You have 2 girls to raise alone and a company to run, and you haven't. She shook her head. I'm not the only one who has been handed something hard. No, he said. But that doesn't mean yours isn't hard. She looked at him for a moment across the table, across the orange juice and the documents and the Friday evening settling into the house around them. I'll need to find a place of my own, she said. I've been looking. I know, he said. You've been generous, more than you needed to be. You've run this house for 6 weeks, he said. The girls have eaten real food for the first time since August. Ruby showed me her nature journal last night, and she has 12 new entries because you've been going out there with her. Addie turned in her history paper on time for the first time this semester. He paused. I don't think generosity is quite the right word for what's been going on here. Nora said nothing. Franklin looked at his glass. He had the careful demeanor of a man who had rehearsed this conversation and then decided to abandon the rehearsal. I'm going to say something, he said, and I want you to understand that you don't owe me any particular response. You can think about it for as long as you want and tell me no, and I will not bring it up again. All right? She watched him. Stay, he said, not as, this isn't a... He stopped and started again, the words uncharacteristically clumsy for a man who was usually so economical. Stay as yourself, in this house, for as long as it makes sense. Let's see what happens. He looked up. That's all I'm saying. The refrigerator hummed. The clock ticked. You don't know enough about me, Nora said. I know you put lemon in the honey tea, he said. I know you go outside with Ruby even when it's 38 degrees. I know you told Addie the truth when she asked if her history paper was too short instead of just telling her it was fine. I know you cry under the oak tree and don't make it anyone else's problem. He paused. I think I know the parts that matter. She was quiet for a long time. Outside, a car pulled into the driveway, the sound of Addie coming home from school. The characteristic way she braked too hard, the door that she always let close a second too fast. Then the sound of a second car door, which meant Ruby had been picked up at the same time. And then the sound of 2 voices approaching the front porch, one high and one lower, the way they talked when they thought no one was listening. Nora listened to them. Okay, she said. Franklin looked at her. I'll stay, she said. For now. Let's see what happens. He nodded. He didn't smile in a big way. Just a small, real one, the kind that doesn't ask for anything. The front door opened and Ruby came in first, stamping her boots on the mat, and saw them sitting at the table and said, Why is there orange juice? Is it a special occasion? No, Franklin said. Just Friday. Friday counts, Ruby said with complete authority, and hung up her coat and came to pour herself a glass. The months that followed were not simple. Nothing real is. There were legal proceedings and difficult phone calls, and boxes that arrived from the old house with Stuart's handwriting on the labels, and a day in December when Nora sat in a law office and signed her name to the end of 11 years. She came home that evening. She had begun, without consciously deciding, to call it home, and went straight to the backyard and stood under the oak tree in the dark, and this time she didn't cry. She just stood there and breathed. Franklin left her there. He understood by then, in the practical, attentive way he understood most things, when she needed the tree and when she needed the kitchen. He had a good instinct for it, and he didn't make a performance of having it. She found work, a position managing operations for a non-profit in town, which suited her in the particular way that jobs suit certain people. Not dramatically, but deeply. She was good at organizing the complicated and rendering the overwhelming into something navigable, and she had been doing it quietly all her life. Addie got into an AP history course and told no one until she had the acceptance letter in hand. Ruby completed her first full nature journal and started a second one. Franklin continued to leave the house at 7:15 and come back by 6 and call when he was late and be tired but not harried. There was an evening in February when the four of them were sitting around the dinner table, and Addie said something that made Ruby laugh. Really laugh, the kind that closes your eyes. And Nora looked across the table at Franklin and he was already looking at her. And neither of them said anything, because nothing needed saying. Spring came. The flower beds woke up without asking permission the way they always do. One afternoon in April, Ruby came home from school and found Nora in the garden with a spade, turning over the beds that had gone wild the previous fall. Ruby dropped her backpack on the porch and got a pair of gloves from the shed. She knew where everything was, they all knew where everything was, and came and knelt in the dirt beside her. They worked without talking for a while. The afternoon was the particular kind of quiet that April afternoons can be. Full, not empty, Nora, Ruby said eventually. Yeah? Ruby was looking at a worm she'd turned up, with the focused regard she gave all small living things. Are you going to stay? For like a long time? Nora looked at her hands in the dirt. Yes, she said. I think so. Ruby nodded, satisfied, and put the worm carefully at the edge of the bed where it would be safe, and went back to digging. Addie was 16 by then, and she had developed the teenager's capacity for cutting observation paired with the teenager's occasional willingness to say exactly what she saw. She said it one evening in May when Franklin was working late and Ruby was asleep, and Addie came and sat at the kitchen table while Nora made tea. Can I ask you something? Addie said. Yes, Nora said. Do you know that my dad hasn't been happy in a really long time? She said it without drama, the way she said most things, directly, as though the directness was a form of respect. Like, since my mom, he's okay. He does everything. But he's been just managing, you know? And I think he kind of forgot that managing isn't the same as living. Nora put the kettle down. He smiles more now, Addie said. Since you've been here, I don't know if you know that. Nora looked at the window. I've noticed, she said quietly. Addie nodded. She pulled one knee up onto her chair, her usual posture. I just wanted to say it out loud. Because I don't think anyone else has. She got up and took her tea and went back to her room, leaving the sentence in the kitchen. Nora would remember for years the moment she understood that she had stopped being a guest. It was an ordinary morning in June. Franklin had already left. Ruby was eating cereal. Addie was looking for her left shoe with increasing desperation. The radio was on. The window was open and the morning came through it. Addie found the shoe and went out the door, and the house settled into its ordinary silence, and Ruby finished her cereal and rinsed the bowl without being asked. She had started doing that around February, unremarked, and picked up her backpack. She stopped at the door. Bye, Nora, she said. Bye, honey, Nora said without thinking. The door closed. The kitchen was quiet. The radio played something instrumental and easy. Nora stood at the counter with her coffee and looked out at the backyard and the oak tree and the flower beds that were coming in now, full and green and a little wild. She had not been able to give a child a life. She had thought for a long time that this was the defining thing about her, the empty space at the center of everything she had tried to build. But here was the morning. Here was the house. Here were the two children she had not given birth to, who called her by her name, which was its own kind of being called. Here was the man who had found her on a bench in the cold and had not made her explain herself, who ran 400 jobs in a county he'd lived in all his life, and wore an old jacket and drove an old car, and had never once felt the need to tell her any of it, who had said stay with the simplicity of someone stating a true thing. She was not the mother of this family. She had not arrived that way, and she would not claim a word that wasn't hers to claim. But she was something. She was the person who put lemon in the honey tea and went outside with Ruby in the cold and told Addie the truth about her history paper and stood under the oak tree when she needed to breathe. She was, it turned out, exactly enough.